Ever since the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords, intended to steer Israel and the Palestinians toward conflict resolution. Yet today, following Hamas's brutal October the 7th attack on Israel and the latter's ruthless response, efforts by the global community seem to be at an impasse. Is establishing a viable Palestinian state alongside Israel the only pathway to breaking the deadlock? Is the two-state solution even still viable, given the intractable nature of the conflict? Which countries are best placed to have the greatest and most positive influence, and what might the impediments be? To consider these and related questions, please tune in. Please tune in. Hello and welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host over the next hour for this Democracy Forum debate on a seemingly insoluble issue that has been a troublesome and violent backdrop for most of our lives: Israel-Palestine hostilities. Why, when there are so many other conflicts around the world, can be brought to an end, does this one endure? How much can the international community drive the solution, or after more than 70 years, is it in fact the problem, familiar with territorial and religious conflict? Are there any new ideas to end the never-ending war? To find out, the Democracy Forum has brought together a superb panel: Helia, Toby Green, Gregory Gorss. But before we seek their insight, I ask the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the canvas and the background of our discussion.
Good afternoon and welcome to this panel event, which has been convened to offer a fresh perspective on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. 10 months have lapsed since Hamas militants launched a multi-pronged assault on Israel, resulting in 1,200 casualties and 200 hostages. The military response of the Israeli Defense Force has been devastating, amounting to over 40,000 Palestinian casualties and the destruction of 80% of Gaza City. Indeed, Israel's right to defend itself has now become completely enmeshed in Palestine's case for international recognition as a sovereign state, and where the conflict appears inevitably to be spreading more widely with every risk of further escalation. It's timely, therefore, that the Democracy Forum is addressing this complex issue with the participation of such an experienced panel of Middle East specialists. I'm grateful that Humphrey Hawksley has agreed to act as moderator, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion. International reaction to the current hostilities has followed predictable lines: moral affirmation and material assistance for Israel's military response, initially enjoyed bipartisan support in Washington, but increasingly it risks losing this unanimity. Despite leading Democrats insisting that military assistance to Israel must be conditional, it's not clear what leverage President Biden effectively holds. As Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace reflects, I quote, "The influence of any outside party, even one that has theoretically on paper an enormous amount of influence on Israel, is limited." Meanwhile, the conflict has received detailed scrutiny by the full panoply of international justice. The decision by Karim Khan, prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, on the 20th of May, to seek arrest warrants for the leaders of both Israel and Hamas was quickly followed by an International Court of Justice, ICJ, ruling that Israel must halt any military operation in Rafah that could harm civilians. And last week, an advisory ruling by the ICJ declared Israel's long-term occupation of Palestinian territory as unlawful. Writing for Chatham House, Yossi Mecklenburg observes that, I quote, even if both courts are incapable of stopping the war, their decisions are an important part of accumulating pressure, which may yet grow great enough to force Israel to accept a ceasefire. And meeting in January in response to the conflict and the unfolding humanitarian crisis, Antonio Guterres, United Nations Secretary General, addressed the Security Council, stating that a lasting end to hostilities can only be achieved through a two-state solution. I quote, any refusal to accept the solution by any party must be firmly rejected, he said. The Israeli opposition leader, Yair Lapid, interviewed by the New York Times in April, expressed his belief that while it must inevitably embrace the two-state solution, Israel must not lose its legitimacy as one of the few functioning democratic states in the region. I quote, in order to stay the strongest country in the Middle East, we also need to stay the strongest democracy. And in order to be that democracy, we have to start the long journey, the first step of the 1,000-mile journey to separate us from the Palestinians, he said. But what sort of state would Palestine become? There is scarce evidence of its democratic credentials. The last elections to the Legislative Council were in 2006. The most recent Amnesty International report criticizes the authorities in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for continuing to heavily restrict freedom of expression, association and assembly, and where justice for human rights violations remains elusive. Writing for the Washington Institute, David Makovsky suggests that a future state, I quote, must provide dignity and sovereignty for the Palestinians and be strong enough to deal with extremist actors like Hamas without militarizing and posing a security threat to Israel. This is a delicate balance without international parallels, he concludes, but it's not impossible. Or is it? I look forward to hearing our panelists' views on this issue and the discussion that will follow.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. Is it impossible? Extremism on both sides, a quest for dignity and sovereignty, and of course the need for good governance. Our first panelist is Dr. H.A. Helia, Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, with a career in government, corporate, and academia, and connected to a swathe of influential think tanks. Dr. Helia joins us from the region and is going to give us a regional perspective. If the international community did back off, could the region fix this conflict itself? H.A. Helia, give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. I appreciate the invitation from Lord Bruce, and I look forward to hearing from other panelists. I will say I'm not going to talk specifically about the region per se, because I think the international community is actually closer to a consensus on this issue more broadly, but it's really what we mean by the international community. And I'll take the few minutes that I have to get into that and how difficult it is for many of us in London, in DC, and these are the two places where I work, at the Carnegie Endowment, but also at RUSI, how difficult it is for us to get out of, frankly, our own bubbles in this regard. Because within Washington, within London, the perception is that, this is basically a conflict between two sides, the Israelis versus the Palestinians. We need to come to some sort of balance. There's a long-running struggle between the two, and they'll have to give and take. I think that there's a lot of that sort of impression going on, but the framing in that regard is very different when you look at the vast majority of the international community. When you look at Africa, when you look at Asia, when you look at Southeast Asia, when you look at South America, And increasingly, I have to say, within most Western countries, at least in terms of public opinion. I think that the framing is very different. The framing is much more about an occupied people, an occupied territory, and the need to restore the impact of international law on precisely that issue. So, Lord Bruce mentioned the ICC and the ICJ. The ICC is very significant, of course, in this regard, and the vast majority of the world's community respects the ICC and takes its rulings very seriously. Unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., the response of the administration was to basically threaten the ICC, which doesn't say much about DC's upholding of international law. And I think that this is a really crucial sort of point as we look beyond this particular crisis. The credibility of the rules-based order has really been hit over the past 9 months, because the international community sees these moves from countries, particularly like the United States, attacking institutions like the ICC, not taking seriously the ramifications of the ICJ either. And the advisory ruling that was issued last Friday made it very clear that the occupation is illegal, that Israel must withdraw its troops, that settlements need to be pulled out. And this is long before we talk about things like the establishing of a Palestinian state, which, of course, is not down to Israel to decide whether or not it will be good governance or bad governance. One could argue that if that were the litmus test, then what Israel has been doing, not only in Gaza, but over the past few decades in terms of the occupation, would bring its own right to govern in quite question, which I don't think anybody is suggesting. So the way forward, I think, in terms of the international community is somewhat irrelevant as a question. I think the more pertinent question is what would enable the Israelis to move differently on these issues of occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state, or whatever it's going to be in that regard. And that's not the international community, because Israel doesn't pay attention to the international community on these questions. On the contrary, it views the UN as suspect. It just started going through a bill in the Knesset declaring that UNRWA was a terrorist organization, and of course, rejects the ICC and the ICJ's rulings. Rather, it's really about the United States, and I think the United States has a huge responsibility in this regard, because it is the only power internationally that has the leverage that exists over the Israelis. And I disagree with Aaron's assessment in this regard that was mentioned by Lord Bruce, because I think DC has tremendous leverage over the Israelis. It's a question of whether or not it chooses to use it. And in the absence of that willingness to use it, we've seen how Israel has blocked off progress on the peace process, the idea of a day after scenario that includes the major actors, whether it be the PA or otherwise, and ending this incredibly devastating war that has taken the lives of more than 40,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of which, according to the UN, and I think according to most governments in the world, including the United States and the UK, has been overwhelmingly civilian in impact. So I think that really we have to consider strongly these two particular points: the commitment that we have to the rules-based order underpinned by international law, and the ramifications of that if we do, and the willingness of strong actors to proceed on that basis or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Helia. Could I clarify a point? This international community, which you said is irrelevant, but also it is outdated, is it not? In that it's not the same international community that sort of led everybody forward after the fall of the Berlin Wall and that sort of thing. How would you define, whatever you want to call it, the influence of outside powers on the Israel-Palestinian element at the moment, and how's that changed over the decades?
Thank you for that. Let me clarify that statement, because I don't mean that the international community itself is irrelevant. I mean that the impact of the international community on solving this particular issue is irrelevant. And I mean by that it doesn't have the leverage over the actors, particularly with regards to the Israelis. And I say particularly because there's also this temptation in many of our discussions to make it sort of both sides here, right? The Israelis occupy Palestinian territories. The Palestinians don't occupy Israeli territories. So
would it be better, in your view, if the international community, if we're talking about, say, Europe and the US, backed out completely?
No.
And let the region sort it out for itself?
No, not at all, in my opinion, because again, leverage doesn't exist in that regard. The leverage that exists to push the parties towards a resolution fundamentally is in Washington, D.C. It's not in the region. It's not in Europe. It's fundamentally in Washington, D.C. And as long as that remains to be the case, and it does remain to be the case and has been for many decades, then the role of other powers, in my opinion, ought to be impressing upon Washington, D.C., that in order for a stable resolution to come about in this particular conflict, D.C. needs to use the leverage that it has in a responsible fashion.
And if I could just drill you down one more layer before I let you go on this. You say that it's in Washington, D.C., and I think we all know that because the Israeli Prime Minister is about to give an address to the U.S. Congress. But given that there have been so many regional and religious and territorial disputes sorted out around the world without America having to be the key player there, what makes you say that America is so vital in this case?
Oh, okay. No, I get the point of your question now. So let me put it this way. Let me be really clear about this. America, I'm not talking about the United States as some sort of intervening actor that can sort of help the actors along. Okay. Rather, America is deeply involved in this issue. It supports Israel tremendously on the international stage when it comes to the UN and the Security Council. It provides Israel with huge military hardware and support. So there isn't a question here of it withdrawing in order for others to come in. Okay, when we say about when we talk about this theoretical scenario where the U.S. were to withdraw, it wouldn't mean withdrawing. It would simply mean that it continues to be incredibly overbalanced in favor of the Israelis in terms of support, but not doing very much else. So it's not in a neutral position here. On the contrary, it fundamentally puts its weight on the scale.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So, and as that moves on, of course, as you pointed out, the US becomes more exposed to the double standards on the rule of law and the rules-based order. But let me leave that one now, because we now go to Toby Green, visiting fellow at the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics. Last year, he was at the Department of Political Studies at Bar Ilan University in Israel. And before that, an advisor on foreign policy to Isaac Herzog, the leader of the opposition and now Israel's president. So, Toby Green, are there glimmers of opportunity in this? Tell us what you know.
Thank you so much, Humphrey, and thank you to Lord Bruce for inviting me to be part of this panel. I want to make three main points here, really. The first is to talk about why I think a two-state solution is still the only route to resolving this conflict. I would also suggest that that's not going to be achieved through declarations, but a long process, primarily that would be bottom up and outside in. I'll talk a bit about what that means. And to address the question you just asked me, yes, I will suggest that despite this being a moment of great catastrophe, both for Israelis and, of course, for Palestinians, there are, I think, glimmers of opportunity, and I'll try to find them. So, with respect to the question that was raised by by Lord Bruce in his introduction, is the two-state solution still the way to resolve the conflict? And I think it certainly is, and I think it is still attainable. And I think it is worth reiterating what this conflict is about at its core if we're asking that fundamental question. We have two national movements, Jews and Palestinian Arabs, with compelling claims to national self-determination in the same piece of territory, and the only conceivable way to reconcile them in some kind of long-term stable political order is some kind of two-state solution. And it is worth reiterating that because we have not only hardliners on both sides who continue to deny the legitimacy of the national claim of the other side, but we have people here in the UK and elsewhere around the world who are neither Jewish nor Palestinian, who reject the national rights of one side or the other, or have a notion that there is such a thing as a one-state solution, which there certainly isn't. That's a contradiction in terms. Either we'll get progress towards a two-state solution, and I think that'll have to be a long-term and a gradual process, or we'll get continued conflict and bloodshed. But that said, I think also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be seen within a wider regional context, and I'm going to say a word about that also. So the second point I alluded to, I don't think that progress can be secured through declarations, through summits, through third parties recognizing a Palestinian state, through UN resolutions, although all of those have a role to play in the right context at the right time, but they don't in themselves make a difference on the ground. And to the extent that we talk about external pressure, external leverage, whether it's from the United States or any other international actor, that pressure has to be very targeted and very balanced if it's to produce the kinds of effects that we might want to see and not to backfire. And I think that international interventions that are not balanced, that are not one-sided, will not produce the kind of results that we might want to see. I think that applies if we just refer to the ICJ ruling from last week that calls on Israel to end the occupation, declares the occupation to be illegal. That subverts UN Security Council Resolution 242 that was passed in the wake of the 1967 war when the occupation began, which linked Israel's obligation to end the occupation to another equally important principle, which is ending belligerency and threats against the state of Israel. And that famous UN Security Council resolution said these two principles in parallel are the way to resolve the conflict. So you cannot take one really without the other. And if you want to, certainly from the perspective of many Israelis, what that looks like if Israel ends the occupation, but without measures in place to stop belligerency and threats against the state of Israel, that's what happened in the Gaza Strip. Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005. It ended its occupation there. It got taken over by Hamas. And the result is the cataclysmic war that we're currently seeing. So again, interventions need to reflect the full complexity of the conflict and be balanced in that sense. And in a more immediate sense, if we think about the current pursuit of a ceasefire, there was a suggestion in some of the earlier remarks that pressure on Israel might produce a ceasefire. Well, I think what the Biden administration has understood is that if you put excessive pressure on Israel to stop fighting, you might affect Israel, but you also affect Hamas, in that Hamas will feel less inclined and less pressure to reach a ceasefire. Why would Hamas enter a ceasefire agreement where it gives up and releases the hostages that it's holding and makes those compromises with Israel if it perceives that Israel is under pressure to stop fighting in any case? So we need to really think about how we balance pressure in very calibrated and targeted ways. So if I think it's not necessarily, kind of declarative external interventions that are going to help us move forward, what kind of external action or intervention might work, and where do the opportunities lie? Well, obviously, the first priority is to try and get a ceasefire deal that gets Israeli hostages home, aid into the Gaza Strip, and stabilizes the situation. But beyond that, first of all, there is an opportunity in that Hamas may be displaced as the de facto ruling authority in the Gaza Strip. And of course, its military forces have been already very heavily degraded. And that creates an opportunity to build an alternative Palestinian civilian authority, removes a major barrier to wider progress. And so there should be a strong international focus on how to build an alternative Palestinian civilian governance in the Gaza Strip that is linked to the Palestinian Authority. Although, as Lord Bruce alluded to, that has to be part of a wider effort to rebuild the PA so it can become what it currently is not, which is an authority which has legitimacy for Palestinians and also credibility and acceptability for Israelis. So that's the bottom-up element that I mentioned earlier, the bottom-up state-building effort, building the institutions on the ground. To do that effectively, however, you will need a different kind of Israeli government from the one that we currently have. And that's where the other potential opportunity lies. Netanyahu's government is hanging by a thread. Don't be deceived by the show that we're going to see in Washington today with Netanyahu speaking before Congress. He's in Washington because he's unpopular in Israel. And there is likely to be an election in Israel towards the end of this year or perhaps early in the new year. And polls suggest that an alternative coalition will be much more pragmatic. But if international actors want to create the conditions for a more pragmatic government to replace that of Netanyahu and his far-right coalition partners, it's very important to be very sensitive to what is happening in Israeli society right now. So, for example, if in a future election the issue is Palestinian state or no Palestinian state, that has the risk of playing into the hands of Netanyahu. The idea of a Palestinian state is not very palatable to the Israeli public right now. It needs to be communicated in a very, very, very careful way. What is appealing to Israelis is expanding the normalization process with Arab states, and especially Saudi Arabia, which has huge economic potential for Israel, but can also be the cornerstone of a regional strategic alliance against Iran and its allies. And the good news in this respect is that Saudi Arabia, alongside the UAE and others, is willing to play a much more active role in terms of normalization with the state of Israel and other contributions, including reconstruction in the Gaza Strip and other areas. That's potentially a game-changing development. And all of that is crucial because the current war is not only an Israeli-Palestinian war. It is a regional war. It was a regional war. It didn't escalate into a regional war, I would argue. I would argue that from day one, it was a regional war. Hamas did what it did with a regional perspective, not just thinking about the Gaza Strip. And it's a war in which an Iranian-led axis is fighting a battle in a long-term war of attrition, the goal of which is to destroy the state of Israel. And that in itself is part of a wider battle to snuff out the hope of an open and tolerant and integrated and pluralistic region, which we glimpsed with the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain and then later Morocco. And we glimpsed through initiatives such as the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which was floated just a month before Hamas launched its attack on Israel. I think the UK and other Western states have a profound interest in ensuring that Iran and its allies fail. The answer is a moderate regional alliance, and the Palestinian component of that should be seen built into that wider regional context. Thank you very much.
Toby, thank you very much for that. I just, could I clarify, you made a very interesting point there about the 1967 UN Security Council resolution countering or contradicting the various international court rulings. Can you explain that a bit more? Because the UN Security Council is actually the arbiter of international law, but we have got these other elements, including the Geneva Convention, that has come out quite clearly about war crimes being committed. So when we are looking at the double standards of the United States that has been mentioned here, what are we looking at, the ICC or the UN Security Council?
So what I was alluding to in terms of the UN Security Council was this is the principle of land for peace. I mean, it's encoded in that Security Council resolution, these two parallel principles, that there is an obligation on Israel to end or to withdraw from territories. And there's an old debate about whether it means all the territories or some of the territories. But there is a parallel obligation for Israel to be free from threats. So, when the ICJ says Israel should end the occupation as soon as possible, well, that's, in my view, seems to be subverting that principle, because ending the occupation needs to be linked to also ending belligerency against the state of Israel. That was the point I was trying to make. And I think more broadly, those international interventions relating specifically to issues of war crimes, whether it's in the ICC or the ICJ, they have to be, and I think the responses of third parties to them have to be thought through in terms of what is going to elicit the kinds of responses that we want to see on the ground. What messages are they sending, firstly to the Israeli public in terms of where the international community stands, and what effect will that have in the internal political struggle in Israel between, the extremist current coalition and a more moderate alternative, but also what messages it's sending to the region, to Iran and its allies in the region, that if it keeps up this kind of struggle against Israel, that Israel will be isolated, marginalized, will lose its international backers. So, is there a risk of giving encouragement to that alliance in pursuing its long-term war?
In which, I mean, we're talking about putting pressure on Israel, and we know that Iran is the one that puts the pressure or runs Hamas. But could, say, you mentioned the Saudi deal there. Could the Saudis put pressure on Israel?
I think what the Saudis can do, which is game-changing, is provide an enormous incentive to the state of Israel that can be transformative. So there is a wide consensus in Israel of the huge desirability of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and putting that on the table, is a huge incentive. So for more moderate Israeli political leaders to sell the idea of a long-term pathway towards a Palestinian state to the Israeli public, the promise of normalization with Saudi Arabia, and also a wider strategic alliance which pushes back on Iran and excludes Hamas, that is a way of making that palatable to the Israeli public.
Yeah. Toby, thank you very much for that. We now go to our final panelist. In the United States, Gregory Gorss from Texas A&M University in the Bush School of Government and Public Service in Washington, D.C., where the Israeli Prime Minister is in a few hours going to address the American Congress. Gregory Gorss's work has appeared in an array of magazines such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy and National Interest. One of his central points, I think, which is really key to what we're discussing, is that the region faces an unpalatable choice between harsh government and no government. And that gives room to groups like Hamas and Islamic State to flourish. And the second point is that regional statehood is built by leaders who have little regard for the democratic niceties that we like to discuss in the West. And that has been proven by Afghanistan and Iraq, that it can't be done by outside powers. So, Gregory Gorss, if I have got that right on your argument, take us from there. What can be done to end this conflict?
Well, thanks very much. As the last speaker on a panel, I'm confronted with the problem that everything that's worth saying has already been said, but it hasn't been said by me, so I'll keep going. I do think that the point about states and non-state actors and weak states or states that in effect don't exist as governing entities is very relevant to the current problem in Gaza and the Arab-Israeli problem more generally. Who started this war? Hamas, a non-state actor. Who is engaged with the Israelis on the Lebanese-Israeli border? Hezbollah, a non-state actor. Who just fired a drone into Israeli territory? The Houthis, a non-state actor from Yemen. The breakdown of state authority in the Arab world is a much larger issue than the specific Israeli conflict. And I see the current crisis in Gaza as part of this larger issue of the decline and in some cases the collapse of state authority in the Arab world. One can trace this collapse back to the Arab Spring, where we saw civil wars emerge in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria. One could trace it back even further to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, when the United States, as a matter of policy, destroyed a very bad Arab government, Saddam Hussein's government, nothing good to say about it, but in the hubristic notion that they could easily rebuild a central authority in Iraq, and that proved to be absolutely incorrect. And so the rise of these non-state actors, facilitated by their support from Iran, which as a revolutionary state in the region, doesn't really have much of an interest in the stability of the status quo, has, I think, been the major issue in the geopolitics of the region. And so contrast that to the countries in the Arab world that are at peace with Israel, Egypt and Jordan on the borders with peace treaties. These are two relatively authoritarian states, but relatively effective states in terms of managing their affairs, making sure that non-state actors don't disrupt either their civil order or their foreign policy, as Hezbollah does in Lebanon, and as Hamas does vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority. So I think that The Gaza issue is embedded in this larger issue of the restoration of state authority in the Arab world as a whole. So what can the international community do? As you said, Humphrey, there's not much evidence that outside actors can build strong states in the region. The United States tried and failed miserably, Afghanistan and Iraq. It seems to me that what you have in the Palestinian-Israeli context is a proto-state in the Palestinian Authority. All sorts of problems with it, concede those from the get-go. But an international community that, despite the differences between the United States and Russia and China and the larger geopolitical contests that are emerging in this new international configuration of power, which we don't quite know what it is, but it's certainly emerging from this period of American unipolarity after the Cold War. I think that they all agree that the Palestinian Authority is the player that represents the Palestinian people. And I think some support for the Palestinian Authority from, if not the international community as a whole, but these very important elements and players in world politics can hopefully bring the Israelis around to a point of view that sees the Palestinian Authority as their partner as opposed to a threat. And here's where Dr. Greene's point about a new government in Israel is really essential. The current government in Israel has been extremely upfront about the fact that it doesn't want to deal with the Palestinian Authority as an actor in Gaza, or even, frankly, as a real authority in the West Bank, because the current government in Israel is committed, again, publicly committed, to holding on to the occupied territories in the West Bank, and even some members of the coalition to the reoccupation of Gaza. And it seems to me that while it's true that outside powers can't force a change of government on Israel and can't force a change in public opinion in Israel, I think that they can act in a way that makes it clear that the Palestinian Authority is who they deal with and who the Israelis need to deal with in order to get something done. Now, there's big issues here, right? 700,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. There's going to have to be some amount of population transfer if you're going to get a real two-state solution. It's very, very difficult. The only thing that I might disagree with Dr. Greene on this is he said that there should be a long-term process. I think that was the problem of the 1990s. So the peace process of the 1990s, right? It envisaged a long-term process for Palestinian statehood, and you lost the configuration of political circumstances in Israel, in the Palestinian community, in the broader Middle East, and at the global level that made possible the beginning of that peace process, of the Oslo process. And I fear that if we were lucky enough to be able to get that set of circumstances that bring together Palestinian politics, Israeli politics, regional politics, and the global picture in a way that could push toward a Palestinian state, we should move quickly and not slowly on that. One more word about Saudi Arabia. Yes, I think that this has been the desire of the Biden administration all along, is to hold out to the Israeli government the prospect of recognition by Saudi Arabia as the carrot for some kind of settlement on Gaza and movement toward a Palestinian state. All sorts of problems with that with the current Israeli government. But we should also note that the Saudis are doing this as part of a triangular deal, right? They have said that what they want from the United States is a security treaty and an agreement by the United States to support the development of a civilian nuclear infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. So it's not simply Israeli-Saudi. There's a triangle here that's very difficult to accomplish. And that brings in the United States, it brings in regional politics, it brings in Israeli domestic politics. And so there's numerous obstacles here as we look forward.
Thank you so much, Gregory. Because I'd just like to clarify this term non-state actor, as we were clarifying the international community, because Hamas was technically elected in 2006, I think. And then there was a firefight war to throw the Palestinian Authority out of Gaza, and then they ran Gaza. At what stage do they go from state actor to non-state actor? So
Hamas won the parliamentary elections in 2006, and with the Palestinian Authority executive still being held by Mahmoud Abbas, the guy who has it now, and the Fatah party, right? You know, what happened in Gaza in 2007 was, I think, a very complicated story in which the Palestinian Authority, encouraged by Israel and the United States, tried to stage kind of a military coup within Gaza itself to kick Hamas out, and Hamas recognized it, and they kicked the Palestinian Authority out. Very complicated. I think that the difference between non-state actors and state actors is not who controls territory, but rather who is recognized by other players in the region as being a sovereign entity, right? States have interests, right? Larger interests than non-state actors. States have interests that can lead them to make compromises that can lead to peace. Non-state actors, their interests, I think, are much more narrowly defined by ideology, much more narrowly defined than leaders who have to worry about an entire state. And thus, I think that, you know, Hezbollah controls territory in southern Lebanon. There's no question about that.
And has seats in the Lebanese parliament, so and held ministerial offices. So they were a political party within a state,
right? But they also conduct their own foreign policy, right? Independent of the Lebanese state.
Okay. So we have, and I just wanted to, and I want to open this up to everybody. Actually, is that you mentioned that there needs to be a Palestinian government that's built that can run a state. But as you yourself has written about, you know, Afghanistan didn't work particularly. Iraq hasn't been a great success. So what would run the region, Israel-Palestine and whatever, whilst this Palestinian government is being built? The Oslo Accords and the other peace initiatives haven't worked. Not the wrong people have come in to run it. So how do you do that? Gregory, first of all, and then can I just put that around the panel?
Sure.
Very, very briefly. I'm an American, and so we believe in throwing money at problems. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. I would throw a bunch of money at this, but you also throw a bunch of money at the Palestinian Authority. Is some of it going to be wasted? Is some of it going to go to corruption? Of course. But a Palestinian Authority with resources is much better able to vest the interest of its own people in its success. And of course, you have to give them guns, because you're going to ask the Palestinian Authority to, in essence, police whatever deals occur with Israel. And so I'm fine with that. But of course, you need to have some political horizon, that the Palestinian Authority is not simply being the exercising occupation on behalf of the Israelis. You need a Palestinian Authority that has a political horizon toward real independence and sovereignty.
H.A. Helia, how long would it take to build a Palestinian government that can actually control and run a two-state solution?
Thank you for the question. So I think in order to approach this question, we need to start from some basic principles. The first of which, by the way, is that Gaza is occupied, and Gaza has been occupied since 1967. That is the position in international law. It's what the ICJ confirmed. It's what our own government confirmed multiple times in the UK, and is even the position of the State Department, at least until relatively recently, at the very least. And I'm not sure if they've changed that position. We should also be clear that international law stipulates that a withdrawal is mandatory. And with respect to Toby, 242 doesn't condition a withdrawal on anything. It simply says that other things also have to happen, but it doesn't make it a condition. And the Arab Peace Initiative of 2004 actually promised full normalization of Israel in the region, provided a withdrawal took place. And that's not even getting into the issue of settlements, which have nothing to do with establishing security and have everything to do with maintaining control and long-term permanent control of lands that are, again, occupied international law. Now, when it comes to how is Gaza going to be run, I think there are certain parameters that most have agreed upon, but again, it's a problem not that is rooted in the region as much as it's rooted in, frankly, Israeli rejectionism. The Palestinian Authority needs to be given that role in Gaza because there's nobody else. We're not going to have Hamas, right? So you're not going to have little Klansmen or something, as was suggested by different Israeli ministers, running Gaza. It's going to be the Palestinian Authority, and it can be and I would presume that it has to be the Palestinian Authority in coordination with many other actors that are far more professional, have more capacity, and different Arab governments have said that they will participate, but they put it as a condition that they will be invited by a Palestinian Authority in order to do that. And Israel has rejected the Palestinian Authority in Gaza role from the get-go. So we're left with, unfortunately, either complete lawlessness in Gaza, which certainly seems to fit with a lot of designs from this Israeli government, or a complete military garrison in Gaza, permanently speaking. So I think we just have to be very clear about these things and not beat around the bush.
So I mean, is Toby Green, can I ask you this? Is there a possibility that, say, like in Cambodia in the 1990s, which was coming out of genocide and dictatorship and that sort of thing, the UN went in and ran it for a certain amount of time before handing it over, and in Kosovo, the EU and UN went in and ran it and built up a state that could then take control. Is that a possibility in this, or wouldn't that work? Toby?
I mean, there may be a possible element of that. I'll say just a word more about it in a moment, but just to return just to the point about occupation of the Gaza Strip. The point is not whether, international lawyers decide that the Gaza Strip was still occupied or not occupied about after 2005. The point is much simpler. The point is Israel left and Hamas took over, and the consequences of what we see today. That is the point. And so let's turn to the element that we agree on, which is that the Palestinian Authority must be an element of establishing a new non-Hamas Palestinian governance in the Gaza Strip. But the Palestinian Authority, of course, as we know, is very, very weak. So it may be that it's something semi-detached from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which must be reinvigorated and supported financially, I think, as Professor Gause suggested, on its own terms. I agree entirely that a Palestinian civilian authority in the Gaza Strip cannot be constructed, without any attachment to the Palestinian Authority that exists currently.
What about a third-party, so-called neutral force that has worked to some extent in Cambodia and Kosovo and other places? Or is too sensitive and fractious for that to happen?
No, I think those kind of options should be explored. It could be Arab states, it could be Western states, it could be UN states. But I think we have to be realistic about what external powers are going to commit in terms of the exposure they're going to commit to in terms of committing their own people on the ground. Of course, I think what we have to understand is that a prerequisite for establishing a Palestinian administration that isn't Hamas is you have to get rid of Hamas. And the question is, how is that to be achieved, first of all, and that's linked to the complicated stages of the ceasefire proposal that are currently on the table.
Of course, the challenge with that option that you hear in many places around the world is that you can kill a terrorist, but you can't kill an idea, and which is what is happening. We have an interesting question from Ian Clark, who has been thank you, Ian, for all your comments, but this one particularly is: what about the Unity Palestine announced yesterday by China? Is anybody aware of this, or
yes.
Could we talk a bit about Gregory?
Sure. This isn't the first time that an external power has attempted to bring together Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, try to reconstruct a a unified Palestinian governing entity. Saudi Arabia did it, back in the 2000s. Fell apart almost immediately in the Palestinian civil war that led to the current configuration. And so I think it's really interesting that the Chinese are getting involved in this way. They had a success in brokering the restoration of Saudi-Iranian diplomatic relations. I think that, at least from people I've talked to in Saudi Arabia, the complaint about the Chinese is they did that well, but then there was no follow-up to try to build on that momentum to come to some kind of settlement of Saudi Iranian difficulties. It would be interesting if the Chinese tried to bring their growing regional role and their growing international power and stature into trying to achieve some kind of diplomatic progress on Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli issues. I think that they're worried about getting too involved in the Middle East. I think they looked at the Americans and the American experience and basically said, do we really want to have the headaches that the Americans have? And so I don't put a whole lot of stock in this, but maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe the Chinese are taking a different look at the region.
That's right. H.A. Helia, your view on China. I mean, China, could it have influence on Iran, for example, or could it have a bigger leverage, as it were, on bringing some sort of peace to the region?
So I don't put a tremendous amount of stock like Greg in this latest announcement. I think that there have been quite a few reconciliation deals that have been agreed over almost the last 20 years, and they haven't really gotten very far. I also think that this is more, quite frankly, a PR exercise by the Chinese. Even on the Iranian-Saudi deal, it wasn't the Chinese that led the process, right? They were happy to come in at the end and really, be the platform for it. I'm not saying you said otherwise, Greg, by the way. But I think that the main impetus really came from, frankly, the Iraqis and the Omanis. So I don't really think that China has the desire to play a much wider role, nor do others have that desire either. I think that the reality is that this is almost a PR exercise to kind of slap the U.S. in the face. Not to put too fine of a point on it. They'll get a lot out of it because they didn't pay anything for it.
So when we talk about a multipolar world and rising powers, actually in this crisis, we're dealing with the same powers that have been involved.
No, I think, it's interesting. It's interesting you say that, because I think that there's something else here. I think that it's not multipolar. It's a very fragmented version of unipolar, in the sense that, again, the most powerful power in this regard is the United States, but is not willing to use the different elements at its disposal to actually push forward a resolution. Au contraire, by the way, as compared to how the United States has acted previously in history. But I think that that's the reality. And I think, unfortunately, you have an incredible amount of political energy and capital in Washington being used on things like the Saudi normalization deal, which, and with respect to Toby's highlighting of this particular part of our discussion, I don't think is the main show in town. I don't think is likely to take place anytime soon. I think has been oversold as some sort of huge thing that's going to change the nature of the region. But I think serves the purposes of different powers and different governments very well. But I don't think it's going to be going forward anytime soon. And I think the Saudis have made that really clear.
Yeah. And so, Toby, firstly, how much do you agree or disagree with what your fellow panelists just said? But also, Europe, is that got any leverage at all in this in this issue?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, briefly on China, I think I broadly agree. I think China's response to the conflict has reflected a sense of opportunity for China in terms of winning support internationally and marginalizing the United States, painting the US as a warmonger and itself as a peacemaker. And I don't think its interventions are going to be critical in terms of shaping the future of the issues. In terms of Europe's role, obviously the European Union has persistently struggled to play as an influential role as it would like to in the issue for many different reasons. Its own lack of internal coherence and consistency on foreign policy because of different perspectives and interests and agendas of the different member states of the EU have long been a challenge. It lacks the leverage that the United States has for that and other reasons. The United Kingdom now, as an actor outside of the European Union, has certain elements of flexibility because it's not bound, even in theory, by the attempt to establish a common foreign and security policy with other EU members, and it has obviously its relationship with the United States. All of these actors, both European actors individually and collectively, and the United Kingdom, can play a constructive role, but they have to calculate their interventions really based on a close look at what is going on in the region and act on the basis of what they want to achieve and how their actions can be aligned with influencing the parties in the way that they want to move and not be driven by domestic political pressures. So, for example, 3 European states decided to recognize the state of Palestine a month or 2 ago. It made no difference whatsoever. They became the 145th, 6th, and 7th states to recognize the state of Palestine. It made no difference for ordinary Palestinians. These kinds of symbolic interventions can have a political impact and a political power, but they need to be applied and used within a wider context, coordinated with a wider international agenda, as a wider set of incentives and trade-offs that can get the parties to do the things that these states want them to do.
Thank you for that. And of course, the Palestinian vote was very influential in our recent election here. A couple of MPs, cabinet ministers, scraped through because of it. I just wanted to go through very quickly around the table to get back to our title here, what role for the international community, although we're debating exactly what that is. If you could sum that up in just a few words, each of you, bearing in mind, I was thinking, is that this has been with us all our lives, hasn't it? Cambodia hasn't been with us all our lives. Kosovo hasn't been with us all our lives. Colombia hasn't, but this one has been. So if you could just tell us, what can the international community do, or is there any way, different way, new way that we can think of to fix this problem? Let's go from the top again. Let's have H.A. Helia, just a couple of seconds.
Thank you so much. I mean, in a couple of seconds, I think that the world is facing a huge number of crises. We're going to be facing more over time, whether it be Ukraine or this one. And if we're serious about finding a way through it, then I think we have to come back to basics. And that's international law. That's the rules-based order. And if we don't take that seriously now, then I'm afraid we're going to pay an incredible price in the future when we have other crises that really do require law to help us move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Toby Green, are we just talking about anything now that hasn't been talked about in the past 70 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, as I tried to allude in my earlier remarks, this is a catastrophic moment, but also a moment of change. We're not going back to the October 6th situation. That's impossible. And that has to be seen as a moment of opportunity. I think when we're seeing the catastrophic war that we're seeing, then that might make us feel we're further than ever from a resolution, or even moving towards a resolution. But sometimes the terrible costs of war force societies to reevaluate the costs and the options that they have before them. And so we are going to see political change on all sides, and that has to be perceived as a moment of opportunity. We're seeing political change in Israel, among the Palestinians, and in the wider Arab world. And so that has to be the focal point. But as I said earlier, I don't think we're at a ripe moment for a conflict-ending agreement, but we might be at a moment where we can articulate a future, where we can build a consensus around a long-term future and begin to build gradually towards that future.
Thank you very much, Toby Green. And Gregory Gorss, your final thoughts, please.
very briefly, for the United States, press the Israelis on this ceasefire deal that's on the table right now that might open up the possibilities that Toby mentioned. And for the international community, support for the Palestinian Authority, which will have to be the basis for a Palestinian state if one is ever to come into existence.
Thank you very much. And thank you all, H.A. Helia, Toby Green, Gregory Gorss. That was an incredibly insightful debate. Ian Clark, who says, I think you are all underestimating China's influence. And that's a debate for another time. Thank you, too, to Lord Charles Bruce for setting the scene, and for everybody at Democracy Forum for making this debate happen. Please check out our sister publication, Asian Affairs, which explores areas in the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East that are uncovered by mainstream media. And please join us on August the 28th at 2 p.m. British time for our next Democracy Forum debate, what Iran's new reformist president will mean for the country, the region, and beyond. Until then, from all at the Democracy Forum, thank you all for being here, and goodbye.